Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Kent, BoF Sustainability Correspondent in London. Welcome to today's BoF live event. I'm so excited to welcome you to the fourth episode of our online learning series from BoF Live, exploring how to build a sustainable fashion brand. In the first half of our series, we explored what it really means to be sustainable, how to incorporate that into your design practices, and the things companies should be measuring and monitoring to understand and tackle that impact. If you missed those, you can catch up with them on bof.com. In the next episode, we're delving into purchasing practices and how brands can establish supportive partnerships with their suppliers. I'm delighted to be joined today by Marsha Dickson, who's president and co-founder of Better Buying, and Ayesha Barenblat, founder and CEO of Remake. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. We would love to hear your questions, so please share them over the course of our discussion. You can do that by just clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen or popping them into chat. At the end of our conversation, we would love to invite those of you who want to ask your questions on video, so be prepared to chat with us live. And now, on to the conversation. So Marsha, I feel like this is a pretty big topic that we're tackling today, purchasing practices. And it's also a slightly technical one that I think it's not necessarily the first thing people think about when they think about sustainable fashion. So I wondered if you could just start by really laying out why purchasing practices are important and why it's something companies should be thinking about.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, of course, to Business of Fashion for hosting this and inviting me to participate. One thing you didn't say in the introduction is I am an academic. I am a retiring professor from the University of Delaware, and I've spent my entire academic career looking at social responsibility and sustainability in the apparel business. And so I thought I'd start by giving a little bit of history and context, if you'll indulge me, to share where we started beginning to think about purchasing practices. And it was really around 2003, and I was working with a couple of academic colleagues to build what would become the first ever graduate education program focused on socially responsible and sustainable apparel business. And in part of preparing that curriculum, we were asking key stakeholders in the industry what people inside the business needed to know to help advance their company's CSR or sustainability efforts. Actually, I don't think sustainability was even a word used at that point, so it was more CSR compliance. And so we were talking really about what do merchants need to know, what do designers need to know, what do developers need to know, and others inside the brands and retailers in order to help advance CSR. And it was kind of surprising that some of the responses we got from people in the CSR world was, well, nothing. They don't need to really know anything. We have that handled. And so a handful of years later, after a few leading companies had really began to investigate how their own purchasing practices, how their own day-to-day business activities might be contributing to CSR problems in factories, we started to hear that they were digging up, that these leading companies were digging up and finding that anywhere from 50 to over 80% of the non-compliances they were working with in the factories making their product could be traced back to their own day-to-day business practices, their own purchasing practices. So that was huge to understand what, an elephant in the room this had become in interfering with compliance to the codes of conduct and real advancement for workers' rights. So
Marsha,
awareness has grown.
Sorry, just to follow up on that and kind of amplify it a little bit, can you just give a few examples when we say purchasing practices, what kind of thing do we mean?
Absolutely. So we look at Better Buying, we look at 7 areas of purchasing practices that include basically everything bringing product to market, from the time that you're planning and forecasting what your sales you're going to need to achieve in the upcoming season, to the products that you're designing and developing, how you're costing those, the process of ordering and sourcing the production, the payment and terms, how you manage the calendar, whether you meet deadlines and things like that, and even how you handle the audit process with factories. So all that part of business of bringing product to market is captured. Now, some examples of what we use, and I'd like to give you a specific example. In our better buying rating systems under the payment and terms practice category, suppliers anonymously rate their customers' purchasing practices on all these 7 categories, but in payment and terms, they evaluate the extent that their customers' invoices, the invoices were paid on time. So the supplier invoiced the customer, was it paid on time? And if not, how many days late were those payments? They also indicate and evaluate the extent that invoices were paid in full. And if they weren't paid in full, what reasons were given for the reductions? And we don't count reasons, that should be applicable to the supplier, a quality defect that they're responsible for or something, but the things that become more gray. So those are the kind of things we look at, and then we roll that up into the kind of reports that we publish, broadly in the industry, but also reports specifically to companies that point to how they're performing in all those areas against an industry benchmark and recommendations for where they need to improve. So obviously, like with this example, the payment in full and payment on time, not paying a supplier what they expect when they expect it is going to create cash flow problems, and it's going to increase the costs they incur in financing their business operations. I'll later on in the session give some more examples of practices that destabilize suppliers' financial stability, and I'll share some of those later in the season. But just to go back to the kind of the broad areas of impact that purchasing practices have are on excessive overtime and forced labor. They're on the wages that workers are paid. They're on the use of precarious labor, the temporary or migrant labor that doesn't have the same rights as permanent employees, and the safety and health of workers, especially when there's unauthorized subcontracting. And the way that purchasing practices impact those big problem areas is by not giving suppliers enough time to do everything they need to do, and not creating a consistent and financially stable business from which, all good things for workers in the environment flow.
And this feels more relevant than ever this year. And Ayesha, I know that you are very, very involved in looking at how the pandemic has affected the supply base and manufacturers, but particularly in relation to how this relates back to brands' purchasing practices. And I wonder if you could give a little bit more context around how this has played out this year.
Absolutely. I'm so thrilled to be here, Sarah, and wonderful to see Marsha. It's interesting how us as colleagues all happen to know each other, because this is a small world, those of us who've been for many decades saying it's all about purchasing practices. And so in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic, in many ways, the inequities and fragilities of the way the fashion supply chain has been set up have really been cracked wide open and been exasperated. When I think of purchasing practices and you look at trend data over the last 2 decades, it essentially comes down to 2 things, right? The first is that brands push and retailers have en masse been pushing their supplier partners on price. And this holds true whether you're a luxury retailer or a mass marketer and a high street brand. And the second is that we have been shrinking lead time, right? We wanted things in 20 days, now we want them in 10 days. And so what that means is that we want things sooner, faster, cheaper, which means that factories legally and illegally find ways to cut wages, which is by hiring precarious workers, as Marsha pointed out, and also having people work illegal longer hours. It results in injuries, as we've seen with Ali Enterprise and Rana Plaza. And so essentially, it's the way that brands buy that has a deep and lasting impact on fashion's most essential workers. And so COVID is an example of exactly how this all came to a head. So as early as spring, we know that everyone was entering the first lockdown. That seems so far away because now we're entering the next lockdown. And the fashion brands were seeing sluggish online sales, retail stores were closed. And so there was a decision made across the industry to en masse cancel orders that were already in production and in mid-production. And I think for people to understand that, the fashion supply chain operates on debt. And so factories are the ones that take on the fabric liability. They take loans to buy the fabric. They're often having to prepay wages and then wait 60, 90 to 120 days for payment. And so as sales started to soften, brands, in order to shore up their own cash flow, and to assure that they could quell investors as they walk into second quarter earnings, did it at the cost of their suppliers, which meant, asking for retroactive discounts on contracts that had already been set, refusing to take goods that had already arrived in ports or were on ships ready to be picked up, changing payment terms. And, the impact on workers was very swift and devastating. We had the first wave of mass unemployment with workers out on the streets protesting for legally owed wages and severance. This is a predominantly female workforce, so we're up against gender-based violence, pregnant women reporting being fired, more so at a faster rate because you just wanted the workers that can work quickly, workers reporting, nutritional deficiencies because they're having to skip meals, and a lot of union busting activity because those are the first workers often to be targeted when factories are trying to run quickly and fast. Now, with our advocacy and campaigning efforts within PayUp and that relentless work of us really pushing brands to pay up, and for all the citizens listening in, you all did it on Instagram and Twitter and like, no, this is not the way to behave. We were able to recoup 20 billion of that 40 billion in stolen orders at the beginning of the spring. But what's alarming to me is that as we enter the second phase of lockdown, when we know that brands are already sitting on inventory, that order volume essentially is nowhere close to what it was last year, that we again have suppliers reporting steep discounts, some saying that it's even cost below the cost of production. So, think about that. They're essentially asking brands to make product for free in order to sustain the working relationship. So steep discounts, noting that we won't even pay you till the spring of next year, and then providing no flexibility on delivery rates, even though that means that factories aren't able to properly socially distance. And this against the background of an upspring of rising COVID rates. And so, when it comes to, at the end of the day, the biggest issues that are constantly endemic and systemic to the fashion supply chain, why are the most essential workers left high and dry, living paycheck to paycheck, without severance? Why is there so many injuries and accidents? Why is there, all of this human rights violation? It fundamentally comes down to purchasing practices. And post-COVID, if we don't fix it, then we can't really talk about the industry building back better.
I think I think the way you both laid it out is so important, because it takes something that sounds very operational and technical and abstract and really demonstrates the very real impact that it has and why it's so important. And I think one thing that I would amplify that you've both kind of drawn out is what is very apparent in the way these structures work are the inequalities between how these contracts are drawn up. So for instance, Ayesha, when you were talking about brands canceling orders, that was very unilateral. Mm-hmm. And that's part of why so much of the power is held in the hands of the brands, and there's no equality here. And so I think what I'd love to hear from both of you is, when we talk about better purchasing practices, what does that look like? And Marsha, I know Better Buying has just come out with its latest index report, which looks at some actual measurable improvements that we've seen. What do we want to be looking for? What does good look like?
Yeah, and I just want to comment too, not everybody in the industry canceled orders. And so when we went out in April with requests from our subscribers to what should we be doing? What kind of insights can you give us? We were asking suppliers about the good things that were happening too, and the good examples of behaviors, and we're able to glean, what they needed at this point in time, and to see that some companies were doing that. So I just wanted to point that out. But I think Better Buying Institute advocates for the industry-wide transformation of buyer purchasing practices so that those business relationships support buyers and suppliers in achieving their shared financial, environmental, and social responsibility goals. And I think those aren't always shared goals, but they need to be. And so that transformation really requires big changes and small changes. And, probably a lot of you on the call, the example of late payments and payments in full are kind of like, well, that's not anything I can do. That's not my role. There's nothing I can do about that particular part of our business. But there are things that you can do if you're merchants or designers or developers or people in sourcing that help support the financial stability of your suppliers. And certainly, what we saw in the pandemic was a lot of good dialogue and work with suppliers to problem solve. But just keeping in mind in your day-to-day actions, some of the things that like say a designer or a merchant may do is needing to make sure the price you pay covers everything you're asking for. And so sometimes what we see is, in attempts to hit a target price and the margin requirements, the price gets established and then designers push. They push for the freebies. They push for the embellishments. Please can't we have this too? And not listening to the supplier for the ideas and ways to lower costs elsewhere so that they can afford to add that embellishment, but just asking for things that are unreasonable and aren't already included in the cost that's been set. Another simple thing is relatively simple, making sure your work is accurate and on time. So anytime a supplier has to chase details that were left out of tech packs or clarify, something in a purchase order that doesn't completely align with what the decisions and emails said in advance of that, their administrative costs go up, and those are their higher costs than the factory lines. So all of those things, play into whether the prices paid are enough to cover everything you're asking for. So those are kind of things that might represent low-hanging fruit. But interestingly, when we talk to suppliers, they're less interested in the low-hanging fruit and more interested in kind of big areas. And so we're asking companies to improve their forecasting practices in a variety of ways. And the report Sarah mentioned is reflecting that is happening, that companies are improving the rate that suppliers receive forecasts, that they're giving those forecasts out earlier in advance, that they're becoming more accurate with that, and they're having regular dialogue when things need to change. All of that, which helps give the supplier the visibility to what's coming and the ability to plan for a stable workforce to meet those needs. So, but one thing I would caution is that we see companies differ a lot in where they need to improve. And so despite these tips, which might be something, let's work on that in our companies, I would really encourage you to leverage data and insights from suppliers to inform that decision making. So sometimes you might go down a path of trying to fix a problem that really isn't a problem to suppliers. Our subscribers rely on data from their suppliers to drive those meaningful improvements and to point them in the direction of where they need to work.
Ayesha, what's your take on that?
So, I think one of the things that has been fascinating in this entire purchasing practices conversation, and here we are, 30 some years of talking about it, that it has been sort of an initiative that's focused on research, and we have to somehow get the data. And, not saying the important work of Better Buying Initiative isn't important, but the truth is that brands know. And it's fundamentally how the business model is set up that causes this intense price pressure. And this is sort of writ large across the industry, the sort of decline and shrinkage of lead time. And, I think it's very difficult to achieve purchasing practices depending on whether or not your fundamental business model is able to get you to have better production planning, better forecasting, open costing when it comes to how you're pricing product. And so for smaller brands listening in, I'd say there's a path forward. But when we think about trying to retrofit purchasing practices into the large, ultra fast fashion brands, it just fundamentally conflicts with their business model. And so we should just say it as it is, that no amount of research and due diligence is going to change that behavior, because the product is built to be made in small batches. Let's get it quickly to stores. Let's see what sells. And based on that, we quickly want to fill it again. And it's at rock bottom prices. And so in that business model of ultra fast fashion, how are you going to treat your suppliers as partners? And how are you going to make any improvements? And so when it comes to what's needed, I mean, I completely agree with Marsha that first and foremost, it's about treating your suppliers and the people who make your product, the workers, as partners. And it turns out that, there are smaller brands, like I remember talking to Safia Minri over at People Tree, who said, working very closely with her strategic suppliers and workers actually provided her some amazing design intelligence as well as efficiency gains. But when it comes to what's most needed in COVID and beyond, I think that's the fundamental thing. Are we treating this as a partnership? Are we working together? So if there is a flood in Cambodia or a COVID-19 outbreak in Sri Lanka, that then we're able to work with you and give you some leeway in terms of when and how product is shipped. The interesting thing about costing is that most brands and retailers today are glorified marketeers. They're so far removed from manufacturing that it's very much this top-down model, of, especially with the auctions, make this product for this price, otherwise I'm going to take it to the next factory over there. And so then you have the factories essentially retrofitting prices based on how they're able to absorb the business. And that's where you start to get both the illegal and legal ways of pressing down on wages. And so unless we have the wage conversation and we're having more bottom up costing of what is it actually going to cost to make this product, and the buyer and supplier as business partners are able to make that decision, we have no transparency today when it comes to what does it take to make the product and what does it take to market it. And that would be the very first step. So, buyers and suppliers as partners with workers is the silver bullet. But I'd say the very first step to get there would be to go transparent, and by transparent, I don't just mean publish your tier 1 supplier base. I want all your factory base, and I want your audit data and your remediation plans, because for too long, the industry has been working in service of brands. And if we actually want to see improvements on where are the hotspots, what are the issues, we need to put it in the public domain so that trade unions, worker partners, advocacy groups as ours can hold the industry accountable. That is true transparency. As long as we all work as glorified consultants to brands and give them data and hope that that'll change behavior, I don't think it's going to happen. And, when it comes to contracts, as we've seen in COVID, there is really an asymmetrical power balance. Most factories don't even have enforceable contracts. It's just purchase orders. And so if we think about the improvements that were made post Rana Plaza with the Accord, it was because it was a binding agreement. And if you were to ask me to dream big, Sarah, on what's it going to take? Well, beyond the good production planning and beyond treating your workers and suppliers as partners, we would want to see binding agreements that are actually enforceable. Put a percentage down so that factories can buy the fabric liability, pay for product with good payment terms so that we're not essentially running this industry on debt. And so at the end of the day, it really does come down to the business model, in my opinion. And smaller brands who either own and operate their factories or have a smaller supply base can do this kind of good production planning, partnerships, and really treating workers as an asset rather than a cost center.
I think it's a really interesting dichotomy between sort of where we push for in terms of structural change and the improvements we can make immediately. And I'm really curious, Marsha, what's your take on the idea that, the really big fast fashion brands, fundamentally the model's just broken, it's never going to work?
Well, and one thing, I don't think all big brands are fast fashion, so there's
Also
a
true.
variety of business models in large brands and retailers. And, we have some of the largest brands and retailers on board with us working on their purchasing practices, and they are improving their purchasing practices. And that's because, I agree, Ayesha, the big dream about what could be different about the industry is great, and one that we need to strive for. But how do we get there is the key. And so I think if we can break this down into actionable work that can happen every day, every day in a big brand, every day in a small brand, to get to that place, then we're all better off. Suppliers don't necessarily want their customers to go out of business, to massively change the business model, because if that's how the supply chain is successful and that's how they meet customer demand, then, suppliers and workers benefit from good business. So the key is, though, I agree, is that partnership with suppliers. And that's what we're hearing over and over again. We don't want to just be called a partner, wink, wink. That means, you need to do everything we demand right now, or you're not going to be our partner in the future. But a real partner that's collaborating together to figure out, how do we meet this crazy market demand? How do we meet the price points of customers and what they're willing to pay? How do we do this together in ways that's fair for everybody, that's fair for the buyer and the supplier and, the workers in the environment? And that's where, the opportunity for real collaboration with suppliers, for real problem solving and insights that they can bring in on, how do we do this better tomorrow? How do we do it better next year? And then how do we do it better over time? I think, for me, the practicalities of digging into what can happen right now, given the industry we're in, is really important to pursue, because we can't wait for the ideal.
I think one thing that maybe would be helpful to do here is just take a step back and examine why we're in this situation, how we got here. Marsha, could you give us a little bit of the history? Why do we have such an imbalance between the manufacturing side of the industry and the marketing side of the industry?
Yeah. There's an awful lot of supply out there. And there's a whole history lesson. I'm a professor, I can go on for days. But back in the day when we were to have the multi-fiber arrangement and we had all those bilateral trade agreements, the world created this massive supply of suppliers that compete with each other from all around the world. And I will tell you that there's too much supply, and so that means that sometimes suppliers don't act in their best interests or their best long-term interests, that they go for the short-term things they need to keep business. So there's I've always loved it when I hear of a supplier who fires a brand, fires a customer that's really difficult to work with, because that's rare. And most of there's a few large multinational manufacturers that are in a position to pick and choose their customer base a bit more, but the majority of the industry is SMEs that really have no choice. They want to keep their business alive and they want to keep workers employed, and so sometimes Ayesha's point about making product for less than it costs, sometimes that's better because the supplier can keep their skilled workforce employed and not lose them, because there's nothing worse than losing your skilled workforce, because that's going to have an impact on the quality in the future. It's going to have an impact on the efficiency, and it's going to have an impact on the ability to deliver when the customer comes back. So, suppliers aren't really great about acting in their best short-term interests or their long-term interests. And that's probably because of this huge global competition.
I'm curious, Ayesha, do you see that changing? I know that in the last few months, certainly from my perspective, I've seen suppliers become much more communicative than they were in the past, which I think is a hugely important step to Marsha's point around advocating for their interests as well.
Yeah, we, through our Pay Up campaigning, have been weekly in touch with suppliers from different places, sharing with us what's happening. And I think it's important for people to know why this culture of secrecy exists, which is really goes back to this asymmetrical balance of power. And so we've had suppliers come to us to say, by talking to press, they've been blacklisted, and that it's very difficult to get any orders against dwindling orders to begin with, as we're looking to, year-end order flow, because they are viewed as troublemakers, or, it's reputationally damaging for the brand. And so, I think it's not enough to say it's not enough to say the suppliers are our partners, right? What are the power dynamics at play that we have to dismantle in order to make this a more equal relationship? And for that, I really think it comes down to legal reform, because look, the fashion industry is largely deregulated, and we haven't really kept up from an international law standpoint when it comes to these global production companies, where they're sending countries and receiving countries. And so when I think of progress, it's very difficult to say, okay, suppliers, now, you're somehow our partners. And that may be true for your tier one strategic suppliers, some who are big multinationals in their own right. I think it also goes to whether or not you're making particular type of value added product, which gives you an ability to push back and pick and choose who your customers are. But when it comes to the basic turnaround quickly, and to Marsha's point, the SMEs, they have very few bargaining chips. And so, it's to say, it's insane that we're saying, look, for factories to keep the skilled workers, we're currently asking them during a pandemic and one of the biggest economic recessions of our time to essentially make product for free, when we know that workers already live paycheck to paycheck. And, some of this consolidation that does need to happen, because we can't have these mom and pop factories with a few sewing machines, and we have too many of them in a Cambodia or a Bangladesh. But as that consolidation happens, we have to remember that the workforce has no safety nets. There's no severance paid. They're already living paycheck to paycheck. And so what's to happen to these millions of women who've relied on this industry, but have somehow been left trapped in a cycle of poverty?
And I think that this structural question, I think, is such an important one. And it kind of gets at this dichotomy again between what can brands do right now and what is the holy grail that we should be aiming to get towards. And also opens up the question, I think, that is even broader beyond this, is where does full responsibility lie? Because once we get into talking about legal structures and social safety nets, then that also brings in issues of government. Yeah. So I think this is, as we have about 10 minutes before we should open this up to questions, because I know us three could go on talking about this forever. But I'd be really curious to hear from both of you, what are the next steps, given that whilst the industry is under huge pressure now, there also is an opportunity to have this conversation, I think, in a very ambitious way right now, because people are open to having it. So, Marsha, from your perspective, how do we push this further?
Yeah, I want to comment on the suppliers and their how increasingly vocal they were. Some of them were, and a lot of them weren't, and a lot of them were pulling back again, because, and that's really why we built Better Buying, to gather feedback from suppliers anonymously, because they don't want to be, and some brands and retailers will come, well, we don't need that anonymous feedback. We have great relationships with our suppliers. We can, we survey them ourselves, or we ask for their insights in the supplier forums. And what the reality of that is nothing happened as a result of that impact or input. And also it makes suppliers really uncomfortable to be the one sitting in a supplier forum that raises their hand and said, you guys need to do better at this, because there's somebody else sitting next to them that will be happy with whatever they can get. So, that continued need to keep the safe space for suppliers to bring their voice and to raise their voice is really critical, and one that we're committed to at Better Buying until it's time. And to the point that we're working with companies on leveraging their data, using the reports to then think about what do we do now? What do we do next? How do we get our suppliers involved in creating solutions, co-creating and collaborating around solutions? Then, we bring people into the table at the same time. But, there needs to be that space for suppliers to freely express their concerns. So, we think we can fundamentally change the way buyers and suppliers engage with each other and significantly improve conditions in workers by understanding what good purchasing practices look like and then using that data. There's nothing more motivating to a company when they hand out a better buying report and if one functional area says, ooh, how come they're doing so well and we're not doing so well? That data, yes, these are things that often a company has a hunch that are problems or have heard there are problems, but there's nothing like 50% or more of your suppliers saying, this is a problem, this is how bad the problem is. And that data can be used to convince others inside the company to take this on. So that's why, what we're doing is effective. It is showing improved purchasing practices because it's solid empirical data that shows clearly, without a question, that your forecasting, your payment practices, whatever they are subpar compared to your peers in the industry. And how do we move forward as a company? There's nothing more motivating than seeing you're behind to find ways to improve.
Well, I think definitely in terms of sort of measurement and transparency and understanding where you are, that is extremely important. Ayesha, I think you probably have a more macro take on where we need to go.
Although, what Marsha said is absolutely true in terms of, the pressure and pitting brands against each other tends to work. We certainly saw that with Pay Up, where, there was a smattering of brands who had never canceled orders, but as we got some to pay up, then others followed suit. And it just goes to show, when in March we were having negotiations, a lot of brands were like, absolutely not. We're in financial trouble ourselves. How are we going to honor these contracts? And the minute the citizen pressure went up, we turned up the heat. Miraculously, they found the money. And so, when we think about big structural changes, and this is something we've been working very closely on in the last couple of months, is to say the conversation is often very brand-led, brand paid for, and in a lot of revisionist history around how brands and retailers tend to behave when it comes to circumstances of tragedy in the fashion industry. So take Rana Plaza, for example, right? We had, with binding agreements through the accord, actual improvements when it comes to health and safety. But when you look at lead brands and what they've paid in terms of prices in Bangladesh, post Rana Plaza, the price actually declined by 13%. And so it's to say we actually haven't learned anything from there. And so what we have put forth is a worker-centric view on what will be the biggest structural changes that are needed so that post-COVID, we never go back to what's happened with billions of dollars of wages essentially stolen from fashion's most essential workers. And so I've put it in the chat there, payupfashion.com. There's 7 action points. And this is not just us as a tiny advocacy organization. We've worked with union organizers, frontline communities, women-led organizations to say, as citizens and workers, what do we need to build back better? And how do we push and hold brands to be accountable rather than brands telling us, well, think about it. And so, in a very short term from now to next year, the urgency is if you are putting in contracts to pay them, honoring the original contract terms, as we've discussed a lot here, but it's also to assure that as factories start to shutter, as they are, and we don't have the ability for factories either because they decide they don't want to or they don't have the money to pay severance and legally owed wages, what are brands doing to leverage their policy positions, but also to dig into their own coffers to pay these workers who've stitched the product and are now left high and dry. What are brands doing from a leverage standpoint to assure that union busting is not happening? How can we keep workers safe as we come out of this economic devastation? So in the short term, those are the things that we think are really needed. But as we look to, what are some of the big structural things in the medium term, it's about transparency that's worker-led rather than brand-led. Surveys are important, hotlines are important, audit data is important, but it's only so important as the constituents who we are trying to help have access to that data. And so we are calling for truly sustainable brands to put it in the public domain. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. It's what'll keep them accountable, and it's how we'll make progress, so that you're not constantly changing the goalpost around living wages or severance or structural changes every time you don't meet those commitments. But at the end of the day, I really do think it comes down to legal reform. We need, where these brands are headquartered, to adopt mandatory human rights due diligence legislation so that brands are legally held accountable for labor violations. And for countries where production is situated, governments need to amend laws so that you can't have these abusive one-sided contracts. I would look, if I were to dream about a future where we have enforceable agreements by all parties, so that you've got the trade unions at the table, the factories at the table, and the brands at the table. That's the only way that we're going to make progress when it comes to purchasing practices.
I think that's really interesting, because it also extends well, it shows how purchasing practices can extend well beyond actually just the process of buying into so many other things. I'm going to go to questions in just a minute, but Marsha, I just wonder if there's anything you want to add before we do.
Yeah. I think the point about mandatory human rights due diligence is really important, and that's why in our latest report we're talking about that. Historically, as Ayesha says, all of this has been brand led. All the auditing and all the efforts have been, even early on when purchasing practices, when the lead time and the price issues were clearly problematic. The idea of brands was, well, we just need to have our suppliers be more productive, be more efficient, be faster, and so there was all this work toward, lean production and putting in place like that. But at some point we have to say, but wait, what do we need to do? Because there's never been that corresponding effort to improve the efficiency and get the waste out of the system of the HQ, where all the design and development and the purchasing is happening. So there's a lot of opportunity to increase efficiency of work there. But what related back to the human rights due diligence, we're suggesting that human rights due diligence isn't just looking up the supply chain at the factories, but it's also looking at your own practices and how you're contributing or causing human rights violations. And so that needs to be an important element. We've built better buying entirely from a supplier point of view. Every question that we have in there is one that suppliers said, this is important for our business, and this is important for our ability to provide good working conditions. That's what we hone in on, the things that matter most to suppliers that they want to see changed. And so, we see a lot of opportunity there to bring their voice to the table in new and different ways.
And
I feel like
love to see as part of this purchasing practices conversation, Sarah and Marsha, is understanding the public policy and lobbying positions of brands.
Oh, yes.
On one hand, we're talking about all of this power dynamic between buyers and suppliers, but even into the guise of COVID, we're seeing a lot of labor laws in sending countries being stripped away because every country is now being pitted against each other for the dwindling order flow. And so it's to say, to your point, it extends far beyond the corporation when, artificially keeping wages down and being in countries where minimum wages are nowhere close to living wages is a very direct effort of lobbying from the brands.
I feel like we'll have to have you both back to do a whole session on public policy, because that deserves a whole session to itself. Yeah. I agree with you, Ayesha and Marsha. It's a really important, interesting topic. I'm going to give our audience an opportunity to ask their own questions. Our first one comes from Daniel Lewis, who is based in New York, who I believe is going to join us on video, which usually takes a couple of seconds to connect, but I'm sure he will be here soon. But on the policy point, yeah, I completely agree. There's so much to dissect there. Hi, Daniel. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to hear your question.
Yes, thank you for having me, and really appreciate the dialogue so far. So my question is actually a two-part question. First is, does the panel agree with the assumption that more responsible buying practices and production practices increase the cost of goods? And if so, will brands need to be more comfortable with slimmer margins, or in the event that they pass along those costs to consumers, are consumers always going to need to pay a premium for sustainable goods, or is there another alternative? Thank you.
I mean, my simple answer to you, Daniel, is yes. Absolutely. Fundamentally, when it comes to sustainability initiatives and efforts and purchasing practices, we never have the conversation around who pays for it. And the truth is, as you look at wages that are made today globally across the fashion system and where we need to get from a living wages standpoint, somewhere that cost has to be absorbed. And so, we do have to have a price premium in order to assure some of these protections. I don't think it's a lot of money. Some of the math I've seen is around $1 more on a $20 t-shirt. But it is then thinking about where does that get cut from a brand level and where can they push it on to customers. We as everyday people have also got used to buying our clothes for a lot cheaper than the cost of production. And the only variable there is wages.
Yeah, I kind of agree to a certain extent that prices will go up, especially when we're talking about living wage, because right now, a lot of times we're not even getting minimum wage covered. But there's just still so much opportunity to get the waste out of the system, to reduce costs, to reduce redundancies. When I think about, particularly in costing, we hear from suppliers, suppliers actually do know how to cost product. They knew how to do that bottoms up pricing. But then here comes the brand with their costing team, with a team for every line item on that cost sheet to make sure to squeeze every penny down to the very lowest. And that's kind of redundant. If let's let the suppliers do the costing and then figure out how to make a product. I mean, I used to be a designer years ago. This was actually when we had production here in the US, right down the street from where I lived and worked. But, when our garments costed out too high for the price point that we knew we needed to hit and the margins we wanted to hit, it was my responsibility as just designer to figure out a way to reduce the cost, to change the buttons, to change the fabrics, to do whatever, to take out some design element. And that's been lost, and that's again back to that history lesson of kind of how we price garments. That whole, basic costing has been lost a bit and needs to be discovered again. So.
And to what extent could better forecasting help with that as well? In terms of keeping costs?
Yeah, so forecasting streamlines efficiencies in production. So it allows the supplier to, one, maintain a stable workforce, two, to make sure that they can plan their production in ways that don't require overtime, for example, or don't, have the big flux of orders back and forth, but that they can keep their lines busy and steady. We see a lot of forecasting errors being on the side of, the brand forecast is like, we're going to need this much space in your factories. Oh, we really only need this much. And then suppliers have idle lines, and those idle lines are costly because there's not product going through and there's not money being made off those, but there's still the overhead being charged. So keeping suppliers busy, and workers busy in a regular work week, and all the time in that is really important and valuable.
And it helps with the liquidity crunch as well. I mean, some of the ways that you see, even in countries where you have a severance fund where, suppliers are doing dodgy things about hiring and firing workers within the 1 year so they don't have to pay in the fund. It's partly because with poor forecasting, you don't have an ability to have, much of a cash flow. And a forecast of even just how much order flow you're going to have quarter over quarter.
Thank you so much for joining us,
Thanks,
Daniel. That was a
Daniel.
great question.
Thank you.
This is such a great way to have Q&A too.
I think our next question is from Stuart Byers, who I'm hoping is going to be able to join us. It's always a little bit of a lottery as to whether or not the connection will work as well. It's, you know, spin the dice and see. Hi, Stuart. How are you? Can you hear us?
Hi. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, of course. Yeah, I think my question is for both. So I think like the issue is really that as sourcing has developed, it's been moved further and further away from retail markets, like in East Asia, for example. And my question is really, as it moves further and further away from retail markets, how do we educate the consumer on this distance to the manufacturer and how they can actually distinguish between a brand that looks after the supplier and a brand that is just taking advantage of a manufacturer in a market far away?
That's great. That's something I've taught, you know, for many, many years now, you know, is how do we know what's happening and how do we verify that? I used to be on the board of the Fair Labor Association, which is really the Washington-based organization that is working to improve factory conditions around the world. And one of the things that they do is publish the results of their audits in those factories, and you know the corrective actions that are required. And I remember when they first came out, you know, they had a huge spreadsheet with all the audit results in them and a 9-point font. And I said, whoa, that's so much detail. But it is detail that people can use and rely on. Now I know Ayesha and I have both had experiences with students and helping them, because you know our students at the University of Delaware in Fashion and Apparel Studies are going into these jobs like merchandising and buying and design and development, and so we've made it a big effort to get them out in the production world, to have them intern in Hong Kong, to have them really understand and see what happens and educate them on because a lot of times you have people inside a company that are making decisions that have impact suppliers and workers that have never been in a factory. So that's really important too, and a first line of education and work that needs to be done, I think.
And I mean, I completely agree with Marsha. You know, pre-COVID, we ran these remake journeys with competitions across fashion design schools where we would take students who are graduating with design degrees or merchandising degrees into production hubs to both see how factories operate, but also sit down, meet with workers in their living environments. And what was so interesting is, you know, cohort after cohort, we've taken students from California College of the Arts, from Parsons, often said, why aren't these things taught to us in school? You know, why don't we understand that whimsical change in design where maybe last minute I'm like, oh, the collar should be round or the pocket should go down or the color should change, and the sort of mass implications it has on the end workforce that's having to work a longer day or may not make overtime and what have you. So I think one of the reasons I'm really hopeful is the role of technology. You know, we know from data that one of the first things garment workers buy when they have some money is a smartphone. You know, even for our own campaigning, we've been able to bring these stories sooner, faster of what's happening with docuseries. There's been sort of a culture shift of really understanding the girl bosses at the other end. And so I think multimedia campaigns, you know, Business of Fashion, these sorts of conversations, you know, the magazines, why not have, you know, Vogue have workers on the cover as we do models. And so I think some of this is really reframing the cultural conversation, but also the education with Western consumers on it's not a robot that made your clothes, it's a human being. But I will say this, Stuart, that, you know, when it comes to good and bad working conditions, that's globally. You know, I can show you wonderful factories that take care of their workers in Bangladesh and terrible ones. And the same can be said about downtown LA or Manchester. And so it does come down to the brands and who they're sourcing with and the business model.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Stuart. I
Stuart.
think we have time for one more question, and we have Rochelle. Rochelle, I'm really sorry. I'm going to try and pronounce your last name, so I apologize in advance. Is it El Jowhari? When you can connect, you can tell me if I got that right. I probably did not. I'm very sorry. Hi, Rochelle. Did I completely butcher your name? I apologize. Oh, can you, Rochelle, I think you're on mute.
She is.
I think you're still on mute, Rochelle. Rochelle, can you unmute? I think we can't hear you right. Perfect.
Yes, there we go. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Hi, how are you? Thank you guys for the discussion today. It's actually been really great.
Thank you for joining
Yeah, so
us.
you actually answered my question, and my last name is El Jahari, so you're good. But you actually answered my question earlier on fast fashion. So I'm pretty new to the industry as a product developer, and I do deal with a lot of, you know, my buyers not buying enough product to meet minimums for our suppliers. So I feel like it's really hard to negotiate properly because I feel like I'm getting a great price or a great cost from their end, but from our end, you know, we have to meet our targets. So it's been great just to like learn or hear about how we should negotiate properly, and also kind of, you know, we have to treat them as a partner. So I don't know if you have any more information to share on that specifically, on how to better interact with my suppliers and kind of balance that rope between my buyers not wanting to buy more and then my suppliers and our costs that we're currently getting.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, you are in a kind of a tough place. And I, you know, one thing that when we think about what needs to happen in companies is people like you asking questions and sharing that up in the right channels within your company to help others understand the problems that are being faced by suppliers. So you're in the position where you're talking to suppliers more every day. One, you need to make sure that what you're developing, it can be done as efficiently and as cost effectively as possible. So suppliers are great sources of ideas. They work with lots of different customers. They know what works, they know what doesn't work, and they can help find some savings, you know, to perhaps help at least. But I, you know, over the years of working with students, I think one of the most frustrating things is when they're exposed to the kinds of issues like this that you're exposed to, and they don't feel like there's a supporting environment in the company to deal with those. What do you do? You know, and that's where you have to start making alliances in the company and find others who believe and see the same things, and find your champions and a group of people that can start to make a little noise within the company and say, hey, we can't do this. You know, we have to support our suppliers. And so you as a single person probably want to find allies in your company with similar concerns and start raising those up to the proper channels. You know, we find more interest in sometimes it's the senior merchants that are kind of stuck in their ways maybe and need to hear some of this, and also why it's good for business to make these changes, because it really is. I mean, we started thinking about better buying, about being better workplace conditions, but it's about better business fundamentally. And so that's a great argument when you can talk about delivery times and quality being affected by the pressures. Then, you know, you have perhaps a more successful argument within your company.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Really appreciate the question. That is time for us. But Marsha, Ayesha, thank you so much for joining. We had such a wide-ranging conversation about so many important topics. I know we could have spoken for much, much longer. And probably we should revisit and talk about some of the things we couldn't speak about in detail this time around. For everyone listening at home or wherever you are, thank you so much for joining. Please stay tuned for updates on the final part in our series on how to build a sustainable fashion brand, which is coming next month. And to the BoF team, thank you so much for making this happen. We will see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Great.